Stop scrolling. What I am about to show you is not a theory, not a political opinion, and not a prediction. Every single number you are about to see is real, documented and sourced from official government data, the Federal Reserve, and the world's largest financial institutions. And the picture they paint together is one that almost no one in mainstream media is putting in front of you in the same room at the same time. So let's do that, right now. Let's start with one number, just one. $39 trillion. That is the national debt of the United States as of March 2026. Say that out loud. 39 trillion. Now here is why that number is terrifying, not just in size, but in speed. The national debt crossed 38 trillion in late October of 2025. It crossed 39 trillion roughly 5 months later. Do the math. That is $6,120 million borrowed every single day. While you were asleep last night, while you were at dinner, while you were watching TV, America quietly added another $6 billion to its tab. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. Countries borrow. It's normal. Debt is just how governments operate. And yes, that is true to a point. But here is the part of the story that almost nobody is telling you. For the first time in the entire history of the United States, and I mean since 1776, since George Washington, since the very moment this country was founded, the federal government paid more than $1 trillion in a single fiscal year just to cover the interest on that debt. $1 trillion. And not one road got built with that money. Not one soldier got paid. Not one hospital received a single dollar of that $1 trillion. Every cent of it went to the cost of carrying debt that already existed. It is the financial equivalent of paying interest on interest with nothing to show for it. What makes this even more alarming is where that interest payment sits in the federal budget. It is now the second largest line item in the entire United States budget, right behind Social Security, ahead of national defense, ahead of Medicaid. And 5 years ago, just 5 years ago, that same interest bill was $345 billion. It nearly tripled in 5 years. And here is what the Congressional Budget Office projects going forward. Interest payments climb from $1 trillion today to $2.1 trillion by 2036, while debt held by the public rises from 98% of GDP right now to 120% over the same period. The previous all-time record for debt was 106%, set in World War II. We are now borrowing more, relative to the size of our economy, than we did to defeat Adolf Hitler. So why doesn't this show up in the headlines? Why does the news talk about GDP growth and a soft landing? Because there is a bluff being run, and it has 3 specific mechanisms keeping it alive. The first one is artificial intelligence spending. Now let me be clear, the technology is real. The investment is real. 5 of the largest American tech companies are expected to spend a combined $700 billion this year on AI infrastructure alone. That is roughly equal to the entire economy of Sweden. And that spending flows directly into GDP calculations, which is how the headline number for 2025 landed at 2.2% annual growth, solid enough to report as a soft landing. But here is what does not get reported. Most of the expensive hardware powering that AI boom, the semiconductors, is imported from overseas, and imports get subtracted from GDP, which means a massive portion of that spending was American companies buying from other countries. When researchers actually adjusted for the import factor, AI's real contribution to domestic growth dropped to somewhere between 20 and 25% of what the headline number suggested. The hand looked better than it was. The second mechanism is trade distortion. Early in 2025, businesses rushed to stockpile imported goods ahead of tariffs. That import surge made GDP look weaker than it was. Then, once tariffs landed, GDP looked stronger than it was. Same economy both times, different optics. And none of it reflected Americans actually becoming more productive or more prosperous. The third signal is the one that is hardest to ignore. In the final quarter of 2025, GDP came in at just 1.4% annualized, the weakest reading in a year. And then, by the first quarter of 2026, the number went negative, minus 0.3% annualized. The first negative quarter since early 2022. That is when the bluff started showing its hand. Now let's get away from the headline numbers for a moment and talk about what is actually happening to real Americans. Because this is where the data gets personal. Total American household debt hit $18.8 trillion in the fourth quarter of 2025, a record. Credit card balances alone reached $1.277 trillion, also a record, the highest recorded since tracking started in 1999. Credit card balances have climbed by $57 billion since the first quarter of 2021. And what makes that climb so revealing is why people are carrying those balances. 55% of Americans with revolving credit card debt are using it to cover essential expenses: food, utilities, basic necessities. Being put on a card that collects 22.3% annual interest, think about what that means concretely. $50 of groceries on a minimum payment card ends up costing more than $60 a year later. And the average cardholder carrying a balance owes nearly $8,000. For most Americans, financial triage and trade-offs are a way of life. Financial triage, that is hospital language. People are not budgeting, they are triaging. Then there are student loans. The serious delinquency rate, 90 days or more past due, sat at 0.7% at the end of 2024. 1 year later, that same number had reached 16.19%, a 23 times increase in 12 months, driven by the end of pandemic-era payment protections. By early 2026, roughly 1 in 4 student loan borrowers was delinquent, approximately triple the pre-pandemic rate. And this shows up nowhere in the confident economic headlines. Jobs should be the anchor, the thing that lets people carry debt and keep moving. So let's look at where the jobs picture actually stands. February of 2026 produced a loss of 92,000 jobs, against forecasts calling for a gain. Job growth has now gone negative in 5 of the last 9 months. Unemployment climbed to 4.5% and is still moving upward. Goldman Sachs projects growth slowing to stall speed. Their way of saying the engine is running, but one bad turn sends everything sideways. For Americans between 16 and 24, unemployment has sat above 10% for 6 consecutive months. And small business owners, the real economic backbone, reported that the share expecting revenue growth fell to its lowest level since 2020. Hiring expectations dropped to multi-year lows at the same time. Here is what makes the job market especially deceptive. Layoffs remain relatively low, but hiring has essentially frozen. The Dallas Federal Reserve estimates that the break-even job growth needed is at the lowest level in the entire post-pandemic period. The bar has been lowered so far that a number that would have been alarming a few years ago now gets reported as stable. The bar moved, not the economy. Now here is something almost nobody on television will say plainly. This economy runs beautifully for some people and quietly erodes the ground beneath everyone else. Researchers call it the K-shaped economy. The metaphor holds perfectly. The top of the letter K climbs, the bottom descends. Same letter, same economy. Wealthy Americans watched their home values climb and their stock portfolios expand through 2025. Below that group, middle-income and lower-income households have been carrying record debt at record interest rates, worrying about their jobs, using credit cards to buy groceries. The moment is approaching when households exhausted by high inflation and record debt finally hit a financial wall. That wall shows up in the housing numbers. Home prices nationally have risen 50% since 2020. Incomes rose 29% over the same period. The 21-point gap is the root of the affordability crisis. And a 30-year fixed mortgage rate, hovering around 6.5%, makes it dramatically worse. A $400,000 mortgage at today's rates costs over $2,500 a month. At the 3% rates of 2021, that same mortgage cost roughly $2,000 a month. That $500 monthly difference has pushed homebuilder confidence to a reading of 38. Wall Street, for once, is being relatively honest about what these numbers say. Moody's runs a machine learning recession model that has correctly preceded every single recession since 1945. As of early 2026, that model sat at 49%. JP Morgan put recession odds at 35%. Goldman raised its estimate to 30%. Bank of America stated that recession risks are underpriced. The last time Moody's model sat this high outside of a recession was September of 2007, 1 year before the financial crisis. Consumer sentiment confirms the signals. The University of Michigan index fell to 53.3 in March 2026, a reading that historically accompanies an active recession. Just a few months earlier, that number had sat above 70. And 40% of Americans believe an economic collapse is coming. When 40% of the population believes something bad is approaching, their behavior changes in ways that can accelerate the very thing they fear. Now, here is the part of this story that separates 2026 from 2008. And it is not reassuring. In 2008, the government still had room to borrow and respond, because the debt was manageable and the interest payments were low enough to absorb a crisis response. Congress could write enormous checks. We no longer have that capacity. The country is almost certain to enter the next shock more indebted than ever before, which may significantly hamper its ability to mount a response. The federal deficit for 2026 is projected at $1.9 trillion, growing every year. Interest payments are already consuming the budget at a rate that leaves almost no room to maneuver. The safety net that existed in 2008 got spent over the 15 years that followed, replaced by a $1 trillion annual interest bill that collects its payment before anything else. The American economy in 2026 is not actually stable. It performs stability, and it performs it well through GDP numbers that obscure what drives them, unemployment figures that measure layoffs more than hiring, and housing stats that hide the crisis. Underneath sits record debt from the federal government down to the individual cardholder, a job market that has frozen, a consumer sentiment reading near recession territory. The pressure is visible for anyone willing to look at the numbers. The question is not whether it is building. It clearly is. The question is whether you understand what is happening and whether you are positioned to respond when the pressure finally releases. That is what needed to be said. If this video gave you something to think about, share it with someone who needs to see it. Subscribe for analysis without the spin. And leave a comment below. Tell me which number surprised you the most. I will see you in the next one.